right, we'd like to ask everybody to take their seats, and we are going to be starting right now. Yes, and I'm going to ask Dean Jeffrey Garrett from the Marshall School of Business to welcome everyone. Thank you. Dean Garrett.
Thanks, Glenn, and good morning, everyone. And I'm sure you're all asking, what's a business school dean doing in the Annenberg School, introducing public diplomacy and international relations? And the answer is that I'm a lapsed political scientist. Lapsed, I hope, not defrocked, is the way I would always think about it. But I think Glenn and Will Obey asked me whether I was willing to be part of this event, I immediately said yes. I didn't know I was going to be asked to do something formal. I wanted to be in the audience and listen to the conversation between the Consul General and Frank Fukuyama because of my massive admiration for Frank and everything that he's done. So I think everyone knows his biography. He now teaches and does research at Stanford University in the Freeman Spogli Institute of International Studies. He runs a master's program in international affairs, and he's associated with the Larry Diamond Center, the Center for Law and Democracy at Stanford. He spent a lot of time on the other side of the country influencing things inside the Beltway. But if you think about his intellectual reach, it just dwarfs that. So let me just make two personal observations. The first one, and I'm going to use the term dialectic, which I hope you will allow me to use since you were a Hegelian scholar in your youth. The dialectic between Fukuyama's End of History and the clash of civilizations and the rise of illiberalism strikes me as the most important dynamic in the world for the last 40 years and will likely continue to be the most important dialectic in the world. I do hope there's a grand synthesis that comes out of this, but for people who aren't old enough to remember, Frank wrote, I think it was in the National Interest, in June 1989, an essay called The End of History that said that both predicted the fall of communism and the fall of the Berlin Wall, but also predicted that the next decade was going to be a decade of the dominance of markets and democracy all around the world. And that was the end of history. That argument looked brilliant, I think, until September the 11th, 2001, when the other side of the dialectic, the clash of civilizations dialectic, authored by Frank's PhD supervisor, Sam Huntington, came into vogue. And, you know, I've studied globalization for my entire academic career. I never thought we could deglobalize in the way that we have deglobalized in the recent past, but the history is still being written about where we end up on that. But no matter what happens in the history, the anchor and the argument behind the intersection of, I think, economic freedom, political freedom, markets, and democracy is really owed to Frank Fukuyama. And that's an incredible legacy to have in our world that's ongoing. The second thing that is a different observation from me is a very personal one. I left USC in May 2008 to become the founding director of an institute on the United States in my home country, in Australia, in Sydney, the US Study Centre. And that was a time when in Australia, there was profound anti-Americanism. So I don't think Barack Obama had made it through the primaries yet. Australians were mad as hell still about the Iraq War, and the financial crisis has started. And into that maelstrom came Frank Fukuyama at the end of May 2008, I think as the first signature American to visit Australia as part of this institute. And I remember you did a brilliant job, in a balanced way, with some criticisms of the United States and the Bush administration, particularly with respect to the Iraq War, but some other don't throw the baby out with the bathwater observations about the United States and about the relationship between the US and Australia. And so that was at a personal level for me, I couldn't have imagined a better launch of a new institute than to have Frank there at an incredibly difficult time, maybe as difficult a time as we're experiencing today. So I think we're all blessed to have Frank and his wisdom with us here on the USC campus. I'm going to stop speaking now. I think I get to introduce my boss, the provost of USC, Andrew Guzman, who also could lay claim to being a lapsed social scientist, but I don't think you're quite as lapsed as I am, Andrew. So if you'd like to succeed me at the podium, I would love to exit stage right.
Thank you, everybody, and thank you, Jeff. Indeed, I am deeply lapsed. I do remember I was a graduate student, a PhD student in economics when The End of History came out, and I was studying international economics and international finance. And I, like countless others in this room and around the world, was really influenced by it. Some of you here are too young to have experienced the sort of scale of the transition at the time and how the future was this blank, this unknown. And Frank was prescient in providing some guidance, if a little provocative with the title of the book, which I think probably helped more than hurt. I want to thank the Center for Public Diplomacy for giving me the opportunity to be here to present this award. I want to sign on to everything Jeff said about the tremendous work by Dr. Fukuyama over the years. He's written multiple books, he's received multiple awards, and we are so thrilled to be able to add our name to that roster and to signal with this award. As with all of his awards, the awards are lovely, but what they represent is far more important. That is the work, the contribution to knowledge, the contributions to practice. Frank has also been involved with the RAND Corporation, the U.S. Department of State's policy planning staff, the President's Council on Bioethics, so it's not mere theory, it's also real-life application. And so I want to congratulate you, Frank, congratulate the center, and on behalf of the university and President Kim, I congratulate you. It's my great honor to present to you the Excellence in Diplomacy Award, which I understand.
It's now my honor to introduce the acting director of the Center for Public Diplomacy and a diplomat in residence here. And I apologized to the Consul General in advance with a personal story that I remember. It's a long time ago, but when I was studying French in high school, our French high school teacher failed all the Australians because his principal view was that Australians could not pronounce anything in French because of the way we do vowel sounds. So with all due apologies, particularly since the Consul General spent time in my hometown of Canberra in Australia, it's my real honor to welcome Julie Duhaut-Bedeau to the stage and to moderate this conversation with Frank Fukuyama. Thanks very much for being here.
Hi everyone, it's good to see all those faces here. I will need my glasses for this. Well, first of all, congratulations on your Excellence in Public Diplomacy Prize. It's a real honor, Dr. Fukuyama, and a pleasure for the Center on Public Diplomacy, for USC Annenberg, and for all USC to host you today on campus. There was a huge, huge excitement on campus when we announced that you were coming here, so thank you, and thank you all for being here. I'm happy and honored to have this conversation with you today, and I have to say that when I started reading your books, I was a student in Paris at Sciences Po, the Institute of Political Science, and you were an absolute rock star there when I studied. And so the student in me today just can't believe what's going on right now. And many people that we have invited today from different generations, from different countries, and we have many consuls general here with us today, shared the same thing, saying, I've read his books when I was a student. So we all had this comment about your work. And what strikes me in your work is that you engage with both profound and diverse concepts, and we will touch upon a few of them, with a complex reasoning that has evolved considerably over time. So it's an understatement to say that your body of work is vast, and we will not be able to cover everything in this conversation. So that probably means that you have an open invitation to return to USC whenever you'd like, so that we can cover even more ground together than today. It was a huge challenge, I just said, to pick up a few notions in your corpus. And we've chosen with my colleagues at CPD the themes of identity, dignity, trust, and social cohesion for today, based on two of your most celebrated works, Trust, the Social Virtues and the Creation of Prosperity, that you've written in 1995, and Identity, the Demand for Dignity and the Politics of Resentment, written in 2018. So we will discuss these two books in light of course, the developments, the trends that we have observed in recent years, and even in the last months. I think we have about 45, 50 minutes for our conversation, but I want to make sure that we have time for the Q&A session, because I've been into too many conferences where there is not enough time for the Q&A, and I feel it's very, very annoying. But before we start this conversation on the concepts and on the two books I've just mentioned, Dr. Fukuyama, and because we are exactly 1 week ago, Charlie Kirk was assassinated on a college campus in Utah. I'd like to have your thoughts today on the rise of political violence, on the state of democracy and political debate in the US.
Okay, well, thank you very much. It's a huge honor to receive this award. It's great to be back in Los Angeles. I lived in this city for almost 10 years, and I admire this school and your program tremendously. So Jeff mentioned the moment of the writing of the end of history, and it was written about 5 months before the fall of the Berlin Wall. And that was a major formative event in my life, because it, to me, expressed the view that actually many people around the world that were living in authoritarian countries did not like that. They hated having to live under dictatorships, and they really wanted freedom. And that's the moment at which communism began to unwind. It finally, Soviet Union fell apart in 1991, and a lot of countries in that region made a transition to democracy, as they did in sub-Saharan Africa. The military dictatorships in Latin America all began to give way to democratically elected governments. I I'm not so sure that the assassination of Charlie Kirk itself is going to be an event of that magnitude, but I would say that the election of Donald Trump for a second term probably signifies a very different kind of world that we are moving into, where the terms of reference may be as changed as they were in November of 1989. We have a president of Russia whose expressed intention is actually to undo that dissolution of the former Soviet Union. And over the last decade, he has been doing everything in his power to try to put that unit back together. He said that the greatest tragedy of the 20th century was the fall of the Soviet Union. And that represents a very different understanding of values and of democracy. And I think that by itself, that would not be as big an event, but for the fact that he has a lot of sympathizers in democratic countries. And in fact, the self-confidence that Americans had in democratic principles in their own constitution is something that is also deteriorating at the moment. And I think, you know, in geopolitical terms, the United States has gotten a lot weaker over the last decade. The central reason, I think, for that weakness is the internal polarization in American politics, which means that we don't have a unified position, let's say, on, you know, how to deal with the rise of China, with the Ukraine war, all of these really big issues. The Middle East is something that we internally disagree on a great deal. And it means that one of the big anchors for liberal democracy in that period from 1989, I think really up until about the year 2008, at the time of the financial crisis when I was in Australia, you know, that period is definitely over at this point. And the real question, I think, is what is going to come out of this, because you've seen the rise of a kind of populist nationalism in many countries that had looked like they were successful, pretty well consolidated liberal democracies, like Hungary, like Turkey, like India, and unfortunately now I think like the United States. What's happened in these democratic, so Russia and China are a different category. I mean, they're consolidated dictatorships that are powerful. They can project their power beyond their borders. But in a way, the more disturbing thing is what's been going on inside existing democracies, in which I think the biggest target is actually, you know, what we call the rule of law. A liberal democracy is democratic because it holds elections, but it is liberal in the sense that it has a rule of law that restricts what the government can do. It preserves a sphere of individual liberty, and it has a set of constitutional checks and balances that prevent the leaders, the executives in those countries, presidents, prime ministers, from doing whatever they want. And that is the thing that is being challenged in many countries around the world, where you have a lot of elected leaders that really don't want to operate under those kinds of constraints. And so the liberal part of democracy is beginning to erode very substantially. And once the liberal part goes, then the democratic part can be manipulated, because now, you know, the ruling party can gerrymander, it can do all sorts of things to make sure that it never loses another election. And I think that that's kind of the challenge that we are facing right now. And it's also, I think, you know, resurgence of a, so this is where I'm going to get into the identity issue, because the biggest complaint about liberal societies, and by liberal I don't mean in American terms, you know, progressive, so forth, I mean classically liberal, that are based on these liberal principles of limited government, constitutional constraints, respect for individual rights. Those are being challenged, and the premise of liberalism that is contained in the American Declaration of Independence, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. That principle is being challenged by many groups that say, we don't want to be just generic human beings, we want to be recognized for a particular religion, a particular ethnicity, a particular national tradition. That is the kind of community that we want. And this is really, I think, the assertion of identity that is really challenging that liberal order. Now, we're going to talk more about identity,
Absolutely.
but I would say that that's kind of the big picture, I think, of where we stand right now.
That's exactly where I wanted you to go, so that's fine. We've decided to call this conversation Navigating Identity and Trust in 2025, and I wanted you to talk about this confrontation that you have studied in depth, which is the one between diverse identities and social cohesion. And you've written about the central paradox that people need recognition of their diverse identities to feel dignity. But when identities become, well, too fragmented, then societies risk losing their cohesion. So how do we reconcile those two needs, dignity and cohesion, in today's polarized societies? You've just mentioned that. How can we renew a sense of national identity that is both unifying and inclusive, and especially when it comes to integrating immigrants, which is a huge challenge for many countries? How do we reconcile those two needs?
So I think the first thing to be said is that identity is part of being a human being. We all have multiple identities. And in fact, I think that those identities begin to multiply as a society becomes more modern, as living standards rise, as the economy changes. If you grow up in a traditional village, you don't have a choice about who you are, right? You're born in a certain kinship group, your religion, your ethnicity, your political identity, all of these things are fixed. You don't feel you have any choice about that. But as you move into a modern, urban, industrial society, all of a sudden you've got a lot of choices, and those societies tend to be much more ethnically diverse, they tend to be more religiously diverse, and so all of a sudden you've got this open field of possible identities that you can adopt, and I think that that is one of the things that gives richness to, human life, that we want to be members of, we don't want to just be generic human beings, we want to be members of particular communities with particular traditions and practices. But the problem, I think, really arises when identity becomes regarded as something that is essential to you. Like the first thing that you want to know about a person is, what sect do they come from? What ethnicity are they? What tribe did they belong to? Rather than either understanding them as a human being who, similar to every other human being on earth, has rights and should be entitled to, the protection of those rights, or else, to be a citizen of a larger unit, that we call a nation. Now, so this, I think, gets into my personal autobiography. So September 11th was mentioned, and I think that actually triggered a number of developments that were important in my thinking about identity, because all of a sudden you had governments, particularly in the Middle East, that fell apart. Two of them fell apart because they're invaded by the United States, so that was Afghanistan and Iraq. But over the next 10, 15 years, you had a lot of countries that basically collapsed. Syria, Libya, Iraq, Bosnia, Somalia. All of these countries fell into basically civil war because they did not have an overriding national identity that was more important than the sectarian identities of their component groups that made them up. So that's an extreme example, I think, of why you need national identity, right? In Syria, for example, I don't think in that country for the last generation anyone has thought of themselves as a Syrian. They think of themselves as an Alawite or Sunni or any of the smaller groups that make that country up, and that has been really deadly. But even in countries that haven't fallen apart, I think that an excessive emphasis on, let's say, ethnic identity can be also a great source of weakness. If you look at Kenya or Nigeria, these are both countries, they've not fallen apart, they've got relatively stable governments, but their politics revolves entirely around a contest among the constituent ethnic groups for who can get political power and therefore who can extract the most resources from the state for their particular ethnic group, and that's not a healthy state to be in. So that was the starting point for my belief that we needed, that every society needs to have a national identity. But then you have to reconcile that need for a national identity with liberalism, because liberalism begins with the premise that all human beings, qua human beings, have rights, and that those rights need to be respected. And that leads certain liberals to actually not like the fact that the world is divided into these different nations. And the question is, how do you reconcile the need for national identity with the liberal principle of universal recognition? I can go into this. I can give you a whole lecture on why I think that's, those are reconcilable. But I think that that's kind of the core of the problem of many societies right now, that they need a national identity for just stability reasons, but they also have very powerful forces that are pushing groups apart.
Well, I'd like to link this with another notion that you've worked on, which is social trust. You gave this summer an extensive interview in the Quiet magazine, which sounds French but is Australian, where you talked in depth about the erosion of social trust. Could you share with us your thoughts on this for those who haven't read this interview this summer?
Well, so as you mentioned, I wrote a book in 1996 called Trust, and I looked at different societies around the world and I categorized them in terms of whether they were high trust societies or low trust societies. So trust is, as I understood it, a reflection of the ability of people to cooperate socially based on informal norms about keeping commitments, about honesty, about fair dealing with other people. And there are big differences between different societies in terms of the level of trust. So the classic case is Italy. The difference between northern Italy and southern Italy, which has been studied by Ed Banfield and Robert Putnam and many great social scientists. In northern Italy, you have a lot of cohesive social groups, football leagues, and all sorts of associations. In southern Italy, you have the mafia, which is really the outgrowth of the lack of trust in that part of Italy. And I think that, so trust is I would describe as a kind of lubricant for both a market economy and a democracy. You need formal institutions, you need court systems, you need governments, and so forth. But if you don't have trust amidst those formal institutions, they don't work very well, because people are constantly trying to take advantage of their fellow citizens, of the other people in their organization. And that's where you begin to need a lot of lawyers and litigation and this sort of thing. Whereas if you trust people on a kind of social basis, things are going to go better. In that book, I had a chapter on the United States in which I said that the U.S. was a high trust society. And the reason I said I'm not the one that invented that notion. Tocqueville, in Democracy in America, visiting the United States in the 1830s, noticed that Americans are really good at associating with one another.
Sure.
And in fact, in the old regime and the revolution, he has this line that says, in his native France, you couldn't find 10 people that could work together on a common project, whereas in the United States, that was really something very easy. Sorry about that. But I think that there's actually a lot of empirical support that shows that that kind of spontaneous social cooperation is much more difficult. Now, in addition to horizontal social trust, there's vertical trust in the government and in big institutions. And what I think I said in that interview that you mentioned is that that's all gone to hell. That Americans do not trust each other any longer because of the polarization, and they never trusted government. I mean, distrust of the state has always been a constituent part of American political culture, but it has gotten to pathological levels, right, where you have major political figures that say there's an active conspiracy on the part of the deep state to take away the rights of ordinary Americans and, for their own benefit. And so I think the United States, in the period between the time I wrote that book and the present, has gone from being a high trust to a low trust society, and it's going to have terrible consequences. You can see it, for example, in the economy, where the first thing they'll tell you in business school, right, is don't politicize your product, because you want to be able to sell to anybody, and that is not something that's been going on in the United States. We're seeing this creeping politicization of, well, I won't mention any particular brand names, but I think you know what I'm talking about. Depending on whether you lean red or blue, you're going to buy certain products and not others, and that's not good for an economy, right? It's just not good. The distrust in the government, I think, is even more toxic, because if you do not believe that your Justice Department and your court system can actually make fair decisions, then you're going to take matters into your own hands. And so that's, that's the erosion of trust, I think, that we're seeing right now.
That's fascinating. I'd like to touch upon always this concept of trust, but now at the international level. And because here at the Center on Public Diplomacy, well, our focus is on the study and the practice of public diplomacy and global influence, and how you engage with foreign audiences. So my questions for you is about trust between a government and foreign audiences. In an age of rising disinformation, how can democracies build credibility and trust with citizens abroad? How can they engage with foreign audiences and be trusted?
Well, I think you'd probably start by not threatening them and threatening to take away, territories that they govern, and not clobbering them with massive tariffs and this sort of thing. Well, that's kind of obvious, because I think that, the United States has managed to throw away really decades of accumulated goodwill on the part of a lot of countries around the world, and they've done it in 6 months. It's really kind of amazing to watch this. But let me talk about the stuff that you do in this particular school of public diplomacy, because I think that this is really important. And my understanding of how public diplomacy ought to work, I think, may give some hint about how you rebuild that kind of trust, right? So I grew up with a lot of the public diplomacy institutions that have just been closed down, particularly Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, but Voice of America, and then all of the radios and media outlets that were created under USAGM, the U.S. Agency for Global Media. It's been very controversial. It wasn't actually smooth sailing in the days when, there was still a lot of funding for these groups, but it was a really, really important aspect of American soft power. And, there's always a little bit of a difference between RFERL and Voice of America, because Voice of America was seen a little bit like a traditional propaganda instrument, where it was trying to portray the United States and its objectives, and kind of highlight that. RFERL, for anybody that had studied Eastern Europe or the former Soviet Union, knew that this was the most reliable source of information on the politics of those regions. And even after the end of the Cold War, I think if you wanted to look for people that had real expertise in, let's say the Balkans and what was going on in, the conflicts there, it would be an RFE/RL journalist. And I think that the credibility and the goodwill that was produced by these organizations didn't result from the fact that they were reflecting an American point of view. I think it reflected the fact that they were good journalists and that they were following parts of the world that the traditional media was not following, right? I mean, there are not a whole lot of ABC, New York Times journalists in North Macedonia trying to figure out what the hell's going on there, right? But there would be an RFE/RL journalist there. And I think it's the same thing that led to the credibility of the BBC, because the BBC, it was primarily an information source. They had a world service that covered every country in the world and provided very credible information about it. And I think that that was really the thing that generated, well, first of all, it's important to have good information, right? If you are struggling between authoritarian government and democracy, what is it that democracies are supposed to offer you? Transparency, information, You can have a window on the world that is better than what you'll get in an authoritarian country. And I think that over the years, that credibility is what created a lot of, goodwill. In the days of the Cold War, people would go into, their back rooms to listen to one of these radios because they knew that their government was lying to them, and the only way they could figure out what was really happening in their societies was, to listen to these foreign radios. And I think that that's what we've given up, by abandoning those institutions. And that suggests that if you want to rebuild some of that goodwill, you've got to rebuild some of that information capability.
Yes. But we also hear people saying that some tools of public diplomacy should be evaluated and updated and adapted to today's world, that AI, new technologies of communication should be used. So how do you see the future of this public diplomacy?
Well, so this is not about public diplomacy per se, it's about the media in general, right? So there's been this unbelievably big shift where people my age continue to read the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. Actually, my wife got rid of our TV 30 years ago, but they continue to watch TV, kind of legacy news channels. They actually read journals with 4,000 or 5,000 word articles, this sort of thing. Now you can correct me, anyone in the audience that is part of Gen Z, but that is not the way that many young people get their information. Things have shifted very, very dramatically into an online world in which the sources of information are very different. And everybody has been struggling to adapt to that. And I think some of the most successful new politicians are the ones that have understood that that shift has taken place, and they've used social media and other platforms to get to audiences that simply aren't going to pick up the New York Times or, watch CBS News, right? So that's a general thing that's going on in media. When it applies to public diplomacy, that same thing is happening. If you look at all of the new anti-establishment populist parties that are coming up in Europe and in other parts of the world, they're relying on those same online channels of communication. And so if you're going to rebuild that capacity, you got to make that transition as fast as possible. I think people are trying to do that. It was interesting, during the Democratic National Convention last year, the legacy journalists were actually put up on the third floor, and the only people allowed down on the first floor with the delegates were representatives of online influencers. I still think the party hasn't quite figured this out yet, but that's a kind of transition that everybody's got to figure out how to make.
You've mentioned soft power, but we're in a world today where hard power seems to overshadow soft power. So where do you think American soft power stands today? Is it still a source of attraction in the world? And how do you see American influence on the world stage?
Well, it's kind of hard to know where to begin in talking about that as a problem. So the clearest source of hard power in the world is actually alliances, right? Like the NATO alliance, US-Japan, US-Korea, security pacts, and those have sustained a huge amount of damage because the current administration doesn't seem to believe that allies are really necessary. But in terms of soft power, right, if you go to Joe Nye's original definition of soft power, it wasn't economic power, it's basically the power of ideas and the power of models. And I would say that at the time of the collapse of the former Soviet Union, it was really American soft power that was the most, I mean, we had NATO and we had troops in Germany and all this stuff, but really I think what brought about that collapse was American soft power, because people saw the United States as a model democracy. They saw the prosperity, the freedom, the kinds of opportunities that you would get, living in a free country like the United States. And that was one of the things that I think drove many people under communism to, want to live in a liberal democracy. And I would say that right now, there aren't a whole lot of people that admire the United States in that fashion. And again, it gets back to this polarization issue. Like, what country in the world wants to have people that are assassinating each other because they hate each other so much, right? It's not a very attractive social model. And so soft power is really important. I think we're kind of casually throwing a lot of it away unnecessarily. That's, I think, the situation that we're in right now. The thing that I don't understand is like the attack on on US AGM and the radios and so forth. I don't understand why they're doing it. What do they think what benefit is supposed to come out of closing down these soft power institutions? I mean, maybe someone has an answer to that, but it just seems to me like a completely self-inflicted wound that weakens the United States for no clear benefit,
I wanted to follow up on this and on what we tend to call the post-truth world. Fake news, conspiracy theories, massive disinformation, all amplified by technology, and this is something that we teach and study here at Edinburgh School. How would you describe the world? Would you describe it as post-truth? Would you describe it as surreal? How do you qualify the world?
Well, there's a lot of different dimensions to this. So I think that I have a former colleague at Stanford, Renee DiResta, that wrote a very good book that I would recommend called Invisible Rulers. And I think that she basically understands very well. She started out as she did research on the anti-vax movement and then on election denialism and these various other forms of misinformation that were going around. And, her account is actually quite interesting because it, I think, correctly identifies the dynamic that has been created by these big internet platforms. That some people deliberately want to spread, misinformation, but a lot of the problem and a lot of the extremism is built into the business model of a lot of the large internet platforms. So I have my own little YouTube channel called Frankly Fukuyama, and I can see from watching the responses to this exactly what Renee is talking about, because the incentives of the platforms is obviously attention. They want to maximize viewer attention. And if you've ever posted anything, if you post a sensible, informative discussion about some contemporary issue, you'll get a few people that like it, but basically you won't attract any followers or likes or whatnot. the moment you say anything edgy, scurrilous, something that really breaks a lot of boundaries, all of a sudden you see that your lights just shoot up, and then it becomes like a drug, because what you want is to have a successful influencer, role, and so you're going to feed more and more of this stuff to your viewers. And so, she argues that the extremism is actually being generated by the audiences that are reacting to the things that are being posted, and you don't have any of the intermediaries, the legacy media that used to prevent the worst excesses of this kind of user-driven extreme content, and that's really the problem, and that the big platforms profit off of this stuff. I don't think they were deliberately trying to push things in that direction. That may not be true anymore, with Grok and so forth. But basically, it was a unexpected, self-generated phenomenon based on the business models of these large internet platforms, and that's really the other thing was the recommendation algorithms played a very toxic role. So there's a large QAnon following among yoga moms, right? So why should this be the case? Why, if you're a yoga mom, why would you be interested in QAnon? And it turns out that there was evidently one very popular yoga instructor that got into QAnon, and then the recommendation algorithm said, this person has a big following, he likes QAnon, and he does yoga, and so therefore we're going to suggest, QAnon material to people that like yoga, because that seems to be a pattern in the data. And there, you have two completely unrelated interest pools that somehow get linked to each other simply because of the recommendation algorithms. Completely unintended result, but that's what happened.
I'd like to move from, we've mentioned public diplomacy, soft power, moving on to the international situation and international relations today. I'd like to share a feeling that I have been having recently, and I think people in the audience might share this feeling, that it's very hard these days to make sense of the ongoing events on the international stage. I'll just mention a few things, but the rapprochement between countries based on a few momentary converging interests versus the long-term alliances that you've mentioned. The profound questioning of the international system, the rules-based order as we knew it, the reversals of well-established foreign policy positions, this growing instability, the volatility in international relations, and the events unfolding at a breakneck pace. How do you make sense of all of this? How do you maintain the calm, the serenity that is really necessary to understand these events and the trends? How do you take the step back to analyze what we are witnessing?
Well, first of all, I myself am perpetually panicked because it seems like every day, you see another piece of evidence about the way that old order is crumbling. I do think that it's necessary to, be analytical about this, because there are profound reasons why people are unhappy with that old liberal world order. The most obvious one has to do with the economics of it, that, it really did benefit certain groups in the global economy, and it hurt the interests of others. And if you're not aware of that, you don't understand one of the original motives for the decay of that liberal order. But, in other respects, I think that things have happened that are just surprising, that I don't think I would certainly not have predicted from any of the prior conditions that existed. I do think that technology actually plays a bigger role. So when people talk about, there have been now almost a decade of social scientists trying to explain the rise of populist nationalism in democratic countries all over the world. And I actually have now come to the conclusion that the economic part is important, but the cultural side of it is probably more important. This feeling that certain groups are not being respected by elites in their countries, and that's driving a lot of the anger. And the question then is, why do they feel that kind of disrespect? Because there have always been elites and there's always been social inequality, you know, but why now? And I do think that it is this combination of the economic changes that have happened that are amplified, the respect, the uneven distribution of respect has been greatly exacerbated, I think, by, you know, modern technology. That's as close as I can come to a kind of generalization about, you know, why I think we're in this particular moment.
Thank you. I know I've promised to keep time for the Q&A, so I'll have one last question for you that is related to the audience today. We have many students and the next generation of diplomats and business people and more broadly people who will be involved, who would like to pursue international careers, and they have different backgrounds and different nationalities, but they will face, coming into their career, contested global narratives. They will be confronted with disinformation, with the fractured identities at home that we've just discussed. So what advice would you give to this next generation of diplomats and business people?
Well, I think that you cannot build a decent world order if you do not have a certain level of agreement on some basic values, actually. And, you know, the old liberal order had been based on liberal values. That is to say, we want to respect, you know, the dignity of all individuals in the world. We want to maintain a rule of law that protects that dignity, that equal dignity. And I think that if you don't accept those kinds of premises, you can get rich, you know, you can be a successful politician, but the old order was really based on a kind of consensus around that set of values, you know, about things like democracy. And so I do think that you have to combine, you know, your pragmatic abilities to deal with the world with an underlying set of values that motivate you to get up in the morning, right? You have to have some kind of vision about what a better world is going to look like, and if it's not there yet, you know, how you might go about making it better. I think if you don't start with that, then you're just going to have this, you know, war of all against all.
Thank you so much, Dr. Fukuyama, for all your insights. It's been an absolute pleasure to have this conversation with you. So I would like now to move on to the Q&A with the audience. And to open this Q&A session, I'd like to ask a master's student in public diplomacy to start the Q&A. We usually like to do that. So you may not know that USC is the university with the first and probably the only master's program in public diplomacy, and we are very proud of this and very proud of those brilliant students. So I would like to call one of them, and her name is Cristina Fomunio, who is a first-year Master of Public Diplomacy student at USC. Hey, Cristina. It's great to have you here. Cristina, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Fukuyama, for joining us today. Similar to Julie, during my undergrad, I also had the experience of reading some of your work, so it's interesting to see how your influence is within all of the generations. So thank you for being here. My question for you today is that many people, young people particularly, across the world, as you mentioned, there's been a great amount of democratic backsliding within the next decade, have experienced a greater mistrust in governments. We've seen this in Nepal, but also here in the United States with recent backlash on university campuses with student activism. So my question to you is, how important is it for governments to build trust within young communities, and what are some advice or tips for governments that are failing to do that at the moment? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that question. So I run a international public policy program at Stanford, and it's something that we are trying to wrestle with all the time. I think that one of the problems is that, well, okay, a couple things to say. I think that distrust in government, first of all, varies very much from one society to another, and it's always been extremely low in the United States. It's much higher in Europe, it's higher in Japan, Korea, other Asian democracies. They just have different historical traditions, but it's particularly low in the United States. But it's actually getting lower almost everywhere. And part of the reason for that is that governments have been less effective in actually doing stuff that people can visibly see benefiting them. So this would be a whole nother seminar. I could tell you about California, the state of California, why it is that we have a housing crisis, why we haven't built high-speed rail, why we've got all sorts of social problems that are theoretically solvable but have not been solved. And I think that really has to do with a lot of the obstacles that we ourselves have put in the way of the effectiveness of governments. And so I think that if you could clear the way where people could see that they vote for somebody and it actually changes life in their community, that would be one way of rebuilding trust. Now, given the internet and all the other stuff I was talking about, it may not be enough, but that's what governments are supposed to do. They're supposed to be responsible to what people want, and if they're not being responsive in a visible way, then I think they're going to lose legitimacy.
I'm going to ask a second question from another first-year Master of Public Diplomacy student, Victor Estrada. Hey, Victor. Victor previously worked as an urban planner for several cities across Southern California, so his profile is really interesting, and he recently completed an internship with the United Nations Population Fund in New York. Victor, do you have a question?
Yeah, it's really a pleasure to really hear this seminar and kind of just get more of your point of views. I did have a question. For young professionals entering the UN system, what role do you think we can realistically play in strengthening trust and legitimacy in multilateral cooperation?
Well, I think that a lot of it depends on the particular part of the UN system that you're operating in. I think that in terms of the high-level geopolitical issues that the UN was really designed to deal with, it's never been effective, and I don't see a way that it is going to be effective in the future. That is to say, you know as well as I do the problems in the Security Council, that because of the P5's vetoes, you can't really agree on any intervention that affects the interests of any of those permanent members. Therefore, you can't do anything about some of the really big conflicts. And I don't think that that's really a fixable problem. The most effective parts of the UN system have always been the specialized agencies. And I think that, those are the area, and there's actually, even outside of the UN system, there are a lot of international cooperation mechanisms that are really critical for the functioning of the global economy that don't get a whole lot of attention. And I would think that making some of those organizations, truly effective would be an important contribution. And those are areas where it requires not just a general education, but also kind of specialized knowledge, because that's the nature of those specialized agencies. The World Health Organization, for example, I mean, that's probably the chief example of, a specialized agency that's been under a lot of scrutiny. it's got a lot of problems right now. It didn't respond to COVID, particularly well. And I think that an effort to actually study what some of those problems were and then to come up with a strategy for fixing that is something that I can imagine actually happening. I can't imagine the Security Council getting fixed, but I can imagine, the World Health Organization doing a better job the next time you face, a global pandemic.
Who would like to ask a question? Oh, many people. I saw your hand first. Go ahead.
Hi, thank you so much for this opportunity. My name is Gabriel Kahn. I'm on the journalism faculty here. You referenced this several times during your talk about the role that our communications infrastructure plays in creating our current reality and the incentive structure that is essentially baked into so many of these platforms. So this is kind of a chicken or the egg question, but I very much wonder if that isn't the prime mover of the current situation, and if we could imagine even any type of change, pendulum swing, et cetera, with this current incentive structure that incentivizes extreme views, rewards that, and creates this social fragmentation by technological design.
Okay, I'm glad you asked that question. I actually have a couple of suggestions. The first is, in 2020, I chaired a Stanford working group on platform scale, in which we argued that the big issue with these big platforms is the size and the political effect. Antitrust law concentrates on economic harms, but it doesn't deal with the political harms of concentrated corporate power, and particularly of these big tech platforms. Now, I do not think that government regulation of things like hate speech, online communications, I don't think that's going to work. I don't think it's compatible with the First Amendment. I don't actually want the government telling anybody what they think is the truth and not the truth, because that's a power that can be, gravely misused. And I don't think it should be a big, powerful private corporation making those decisions on what the truth is. So our idea was for something we called middleware, where you would create a regulatory environment where the content moderation function would be taken away from these big platforms and given to what would hopefully be an ecosystem of third-party moderators, where you could choose the kind of feed that you would see, on your social media platform, but you would be able to turn the dials and knobs and not have, a big corporation that you had no influence over be the one to do it. Now, the other thing that has really struck me, I wrote an article several years ago called Silvio Berlusconi and the Collapse of Western Civilization, and I identified a certain pathway that I think Berlusconi pioneered, which is that you start out as a rich businessman, you acquire a media empire, you use that media empire to gain political power, and then once you have political power, you protect your business interests, right? That's happened repeatedly in Eastern Europe, in Ukraine, and many parts, of the former communist world. And I updated that article last winter, talking about Elon Musk, because that's exactly what Elon Musk has done. He acquires Twitter not because it's a profitable business, but because he wants political influence. So that helps him influence, last year's election. He doesn't become a prime minister, but he's given a lot of political power by the incoming administration. I suspect he's planted backdoors in every single government database, and that information is going straight to his companies, right? So it's benefiting him in a big way. The other thing that I think should trouble everybody is what Larry Ellison and his son are doing right now in accumulating this unbelievable group of media properties, right? And he's going to end up with much more media power than Musk had. And so I think that there are probably legal ways of doing it. It's very tricky because you run into all these First Amendment kinds of problems. But I think that, for example, you could limit the ability of a industrial corporation to acquire a big media channel, and use it, to directly benefit, that corporation. But in any event, I think that American antitrust law ought to think very hard about concentrated media power, because that is, the underlying problem. Regardless of whether it's on the left or on the right, it's not good that certain people have that much ability to shape public discourse as, exists right now.
Next question. Yes, please. Oh, hi. Go ahead.
Good morning. Thank you so much, Dr. Fukuyama and Madame Julie de Obodos, for this insightful talk. I recently defended my master's research on the subject of woke capitalism, kind of echoing what you mentioned about corporations aligning themselves politically and politicizing their products. Now, I owed this to neoliberalism as a condition and natural course due to the lack of civic identity and trust, everything we mentioned today. And I would love to hear if you agree that this is, an inevitability of neoliberalism.
Well, I don't think neoliberalism is inevitable at all. In fact, I think it's been rolled back very substantially. I think that the thing that I would blame neoliberalism for, well, a couple of things. Obviously, the trading regime had, these big consequences in terms of the American working class and so forth. But the real problem was the dismantling of financial sector regulation. That's what caused the 2008 financial crisis. And I don't think it's going to happen again, because I do think that people began to figure out that if you don't, regulate the heck out of the financial sector, you're going to end up. Now, it's so innovative and it shape-shifts so rapidly that there may be other threats coming out of that sector that we're just not aware of right now. But I think in principle, people understand that you need to regulate it. The Biden administration also rejected a lot of neoliberalism, right? If you roll the clock back 20 years ago and said the US government ought to be protecting the semiconductor sector because that's strategically important, there isn't an economist in the country that would have agreed with you. They would have said that's intolerable use of, state intervention in the market. And I think people are much more willing to accept, the need to do something like that at this point. So the thing is, neoliberalism was just a policy. It was a set of policy choices that were made back in the 1980s and 90s. And as policy choices, you can reverse those policies, relatively easily. And I think a lot of them actually have been reversed already.
Yes, please. Right here.
Thank you very much, Mr. Fukuyama, for your interesting and wise words. My name is Bojko Hristov. I'm the Consul General of Bulgaria in Los Angeles, and I'm really curious. Let's make a little something like prognosis. It was a little bit mentioned, but still I would appreciate a little bit more details on how do you think AI and connected technologies will shape the future of liberal democracy in decades or two? Thank you.
Yeah, I get asked that question a lot, and I have a kind of standard answer, which is I don't know. Because I really think it's sort of like asking, what do you think the effect of electricity will be on democracy back in the 1880s, Nobody would have anticipated, the electrification of the economy, the invention of the computer, all the stuff that's happened since then. And I think we're at such an early stage that it's very hard to say. I think that the challenge, the one thing I do think is true is that the transformation that's going to come about as a result of AI is going to be really enormous, and it's going to affect every aspect of our societies. But it's also going to take a fair amount of time for those effects to be felt, and it's also going to take an even longer period of time for the society to try to adjust to those changes. And that's been the pattern, for technological revolutions in the past. I'm not quite as pessimistic about some of the negative effects on jobs, for example, as some people, because I do think if you look at past revolutions, the nature of work changes, but work doesn't disappear. You're still going to have jobs, but the nature of them is going to be is really going to be quite different.
I think Professor Nicole has a question. Go ahead.
Thank you very much for coming. I teach public diplomacy at USC, so you've met my students, with whom I'm very proud. I think it's interesting how the question of, or the issue of trust has run like a thread through what we've been saying today. And the problems of this world are self-evidently too big for any one country to solve by themselves. We're going to have to work together, but working together requires trust. And this is why the Goethe Institute has talked about trust as being today's greatest currency. But how can cultural diplomacy agencies build trust? Can they build trust? Not the kind of hierarchical trust, oh, you can trust Voice of America to give you balanced news, but we can learn to know each other well enough to fix the climate or to fix migration, or can culture play a role in that? And how do we do that in a constructive way? Well, when the US is doing a 93% budget cut, that makes it a little bit harder, but this is a bigger community than just the US. What can we do collectively through cultural diplomacy? Can we hope to build trust?
I think that's a question that you're in a better position to answer than I am, since that's basically your field of study. It does seem to me that in past decades, American foreign policy has used cultural diplomacy in a lot of really effective and interesting ways. In fact, this online magazine that I helped start, American Purpose, we've had a couple of articles about some of the classic cultural diplomacy initiatives, like sending Dave Brubeck, to Eastern Europe, which generated a huge amount of interest and goodwill. And I think that, the form of culture is important, but and it's going to be very different today, but I think that we could probably do that sort of thing. Trouble is that, can we as a country agree on what aspects of our culture we really want to export? Because unfortunately, right now, some of the less attractive aspects of American culture are actually being exported right now. A lot of the hate groups and, so forth. But yeah, I think that's something we ought to think about very carefully, because there are probably aspects of culture that are politically neutral enough that you could imagine, sending it abroad.
Thank you. Yes, please, go ahead. Yes, you with the hat. There's a mic coming. Go ahead.
Well, thank you, Doctor, for coming to USC today. My question is, as someone who considers himself center-left, I'm curious if you think that there are any left-wing movements globally that are kind of encouraging democratic backsliding. I know particularly a lot of intellectuals have talked about the left-wing government in Mexico as potentially being one of those governments that is on the left as opposed to the right, that is kind of encouraging the erosion of institutional trust that we see in a lot of right-wing governments globally.
Well, I'd have to think about that one. I think that the judicial reform that AMLO started in Mexico and that Mrs. Sheinbaum has continued, they just, finally approved it, is terrible legislation. I think that electing, several thousand judges across the country is really bad. That kind of politicization is not going to lead to a better, more impartial judiciary. I think it's going to lead to actually the capture of large parts of the judiciary, either by the ruling party or by criminal organizations. So that's a example of a left-wing initiative that really I think is going to be very damaging to the rule of law in Mexico. There are probably some other ones, but they're not at the top of my head right now.
More questions? Yes, please. Just here. Thanks, Sandra.
Hi, thank you so much. Big admirer of your work. My name's Ami. Earlier you mentioned, like, to answer her question, how is it really important for liberal democracy to have like tangible results so they can sustain the legitimacy. I'm wondering, like, how do you see we balance like short-term versus long-term goals? So short-term deliveries such as like solving healthcare, job, infrastructure, like the SF homeless and other things, versus like the long-term goals, like having equality, inclusion, and other things, especially as you mentioned, like also to avoid the last man scenario where people are materially satisfied, but then spiritually hollow. I'm wondering, how do you see we balance these goals when sometimes they can be pulling into like different directions?
So I think that, I guess the question, the answer sort of depends on what you mean by, policies for social inclusion, because I think you can do that in better and worse ways. I do think that kind of focusing on some classic economic objectives that will be inclusive would be very important. I mean, again, just to go back to the California example, Ezra Klein has written a lot about this. There is a huge housing crisis here in LA, in San Francisco, in other big American cities. Why is that crisis? Why does that crisis exist? Why do young people not have the opportunity to buy housing in the way that their parents or grandparents did? I think the answer to that is pretty simple and straightforward. There's not enough supply. Why is there not enough supply? Because we have burdened ourselves with so many rules that make it really, really difficult to build dense, decent quality middle-class housing. Because the existing stakeholders, the people that live in, these undense neighborhoods, don't want that kind of housing anywhere near them because they think it's going to affect their property values. And in general, there's a lot of interest groups in the country that are very entrenched and are kind of blocking the ability to create a more competitive society. A more competitive society is going to be a more inclusive and socially fair one, because it's going to mean that somebody other than the entrenched existing stakeholders are going to have an opportunity to, become doctors or nurses or, or whatever. And so I think that my agenda for social inclusion would be to get rid of some of those obstacles that make it impossible to house everybody in the state of California. That would be a good start. I've got a research program that's actually looking in much more detail as to what you would do in order to do that. I think political scientists can actually add a lot. In one of my books, I coined this term vetocracy, right? Which is it's a disease of democracies where you create a political system that's got so many veto points that you actually can't agree on moving ahead with anything. And I think that, in my view of the world, China is at one end, right? They've got one veto point, which is Xi Jinping. It's a dictatorship. And then at the other end of the spectrum, you've got the state of California, which has, millions of veto points. And I think that, if you don't want to become China, but if you shifted a little bit the institutional incentives that exist in making decisions on doing stuff, you would actually have a government that could deliver on, high-speed rail, low-cost housing, healthcare, a lot of different things.
I think we have time for one last question. So, who will that be? Yes, please.
Hi,
Hi, my name is Kajal Reddy. I'm a first year graduate student at Annenberg. I have a very simple question, and it might have a very simple answer too, but what exactly are we doing wrong as Gen Z to not fix this problem? Because I see, like, Nepal's Gen Z was able to overthrow the government overnight and get Sushil Karna as the prime minister. And a couple months ago, when South Korea declared martial law, we were able to get it back overnight. So what happened to the United States? What happened to us, and why am I not seeing progress from our generation to be able to make a difference?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Yeah, well, I don't know. I think that they're probably, the answer is going to have to be a little bit complicated. In Korea, I was just in Korea twice over the summer, and we had a lot of discussions about why Korea was able to protect its democracy in a way that the United States wasn't, and similar discussions in Brazil. They just convicted Bolsonaro, right, of trying to overthrow the government. Why couldn't we do that here? I think part of the answer in both cases is that both of those countries had a more recent experience of dictatorship. The United States has never experienced dictatorship. Young people, have never lived under a dictatorship. Whereas in both Korea and Brazil, you actually, within the living memory of a lot of citizens of those countries, you actually were living under a dictatorship, and you understood how bad that could be. And so it could be that it's that lack of historical grounding, in the experiences that other societies have had that might explain, part of that lack of vigilance in trying to defend your rights, if you're a young person.
Thank you very much. I think it's time to thank you, Dr. Fukuyama, for accepting our invitation. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you for sharing your insightful analysis and even your candid feelings on some questions and issues, and we are very grateful to you for that. On behalf of Willoughby, our dean here at Annenberg School for Communication and Journalism, who couldn't be with us today, unfortunately, and on behalf of the Center on Public Diplomacy, I'd like to thank a few people. Don't worry, it won't take long. I'd like to thank Provost Guzman, Dean Garrett, Dean Noguera, Dean Sony. A huge thank you to James Hu and the Physician Leadership Program, without whom this event would not have been possible. I'd like to thank Barry Sanders, our chairman of the CPD board, and our board members who came today. Thank you to our friends, consuls generals and members of the consular corps here in LA who came to the campus today. Thank you to the wonderful CPD team here, the Annenberg Comms and Event staff, and thank you to the MPD students who have accepted today to be our protocol ambassadors and who have studied very, very early this morning. And last but not least, thank you to all of you here in the audience for attending the Center on Public Diplomacy event and for your great questions. And you can follow us on the CPD social media. You can register to our weekly newsletter, and see you next time. Thank you.